Hi boys and girls, in this video I will be talking about lesson 1-2, which is called tenths and hundredths. In this lesson we're going to learn how to write a fraction as a decimal and a decimal as a fraction, and we will go up to tenths and the hundredths place value spots. So first we can use division to write a fraction as a decimal. For example, if I have the fraction 3/5, I can use division to write this as a decimal. 3/5 also means 3 divided by 5. So I'm going to divide 3 wholes by 5, which seems a bit crazy. People might think that you're not allowed to do that, but really you can. What we would need to do to divide 3 by 5 is make this 3.0. 3.0 is the same as 3, and now I can divide these. Pretend that it's a whole number. So pretend this 3.0 is a 30. How many times would 5 go into 30? That would be exactly 6 times. 6 times 5 is 30, and I have nothing left over. All you need to do with this decimal point that's right here is bring it straight up, and your answer is 0.6, or 0.6. So that is how we can use division to write a fraction as a decimal. Also, you could write a fraction as a decimal by finding an equivalent fraction that's a bit easier to turn into a decimal. For example, if I had something like 1/5, I could make this into something that has a 10 on the bottom because we know about tenths and hundredths, and tenths and hundredths are a bit easier for us to work with. In order to turn this fraction 1/5 into something out of 10, I need to figure out what I'm multiplying the bottom number, the denominator, by. To get from 5 to 10, I multiply the bottom number by 2. So you can make an equivalent by doing the same thing to the top. If I multiply the numerator by 2, 1 times 2 is 2, I now have an equivalent fraction. 1/5 is the same as 2/10. So now when I read this fraction 2/10, you hear that word tenths, which means 2/10. I need a 2 in the tenths place value spot. So after my decimal point, we always have tenths, then hundredths, which means that the 2 needs to be here right after my decimal point. So 0.2 would be the answer. I could also say 0.2, which is the exact same thing. So 1/5 and 0.2 are equivalent because 1/5 equals 2/10. What if we had 1/4 and we need to write that as a decimal? I could either do 1 divided by 4, or I could find something that is equivalent like I did in the last example. The only unfortunate thing is that if I want to put a 10 at the bottom, like in the last example, 4 does not go into 10, so I can't do that. However, hundredths are also pretty easy for us to work with because you've learned about hundredths in the past. I do know that 4 can go into 100. So if I put 100 on the bottom, I can make an equivalent fraction that is in the hundredths place value spot. To get from 4 to 100, I multiply by 25. Remember, as I said in the last example, whatever you do to the bottom number, you must do to the numerator. So I need to multiply that by 25 as well. That's a very important step. Don't just multiply the denominator and not the numerator. 1 times 25 is 25. So now I know that 1/4 is equal to 25 hundredths. Notice when I say this fraction out loud, 25 hundredths, I say the word hundredths, meaning that my number needs to end in the hundredth spot. So I have 25 hundredths. When we read a decimal, you should have learned this in the past, but wherever the number ends, that's the place value spot that you say aloud. Meaning I don't say 0.2 5 hundredths. I read this as 25, and since it ends in the hundredth spot, I say hundredths, 25 hundredths. So since 1/4 is equivalent to 25 hundredths as a fraction, I can write my answer as a decimal. Now let's talk a little bit about doing the reverse, writing a decimal as a fraction. So if you were to get something like 0.23, again, say this number out loud to help you first. We always read the number as a group, 23, and we say the word of where it ends. This ends in the hundredth spot. Since this is the 10th spot and the hundredth spot, and over there's the 1 spot. So we read this as a group, 23, and then you say the place value spot where it ends, hundredths, 23 hundredths. This means that I have something out of 100. When you say that word hundredths, it's out of 100. If it were to be something like this, where it was 3/10, since it's in the 10th spot, your bottom number would be a 10. Let's go back to that first example up top, 23 hundredths. I put hundredths at the bottom because that's the place value spot, and the number that you say is your numerator, 23 over 100. For our second example down there at the bottom, I put it over 10, and 10 is my denominator because that's the place value spot that I say, 3/10. 3 is the number that I say, so that goes up top. A good thing to remember is that you always put the number that you say up top over the place value spot that it ends in. Here's another similar example. If I had something like 7.7, the only thing that's different about this is I do have a whole number. I have a 7. So any number that's in the 1 spot, you write just as itself, 7. This number is in, or this 7 is in the 10th spot. We don't have anything in the 100th spot, so we don't have to worry about that. So we already took care of this 7 here, so now I need to worry about this 7. That, if this 7 wasn't there, is 7/10. So I have 7, and we read decimal points as and 7/10. I say the word tenths, so that's my denominator. Remember, the place value spot is the denominator, and the number that you have is your numerator. 7/10 is 7 over 10. So this whole answer would be 7 and 7/10. A big 7, and then 7 over 10 is a fraction. I want you to go ahead and try this one on your own. This is what you are going to put on the homework portion of your video sheet. So this will go under the 1-2 spot. And I want you to write 1.25 as a fraction or a mixed number. Good luck!